Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to day 2 of the 2022 NPD Directors Meeting, Innovating and Unlocking New Possibilities. My name is Maha Abdelkader. I'm an Education Program Specialist in OWELA, and I have the privilege of welcoming you this morning and introducing our keynote speaker. We have an amazing day planned for you, with presentations from the Department of Education, OWELA, and from your colleagues. Yesterday, we wrapped up the day with an exciting and dynamic networking session, and we want to build on that momentum today with more networking opportunities this afternoon in another networking session and the poster showcase and networking. Yesterday, we heard firsthand from the wonderful panelists how the pandemic has impacted educators, students, and families. And we heard how English learners and other underserved students were the hardest hit by the pandemic's challenges, how their voices were the least likely to be heard, and how their needs were the most likely to be ignored. This morning, our keynote speaker will spotlight English learners in the civil rights landscape. Ms. Suzanne Goldberg has had a long and extensive career promoting equality and advocating for civil rights. She is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategic Operations and Outreach in the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education. Before I welcome her to the podium, I'll tell you a little bit about her expertise at the department and before she joined. Ms. Suzanne Goldberg has served in the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights since day one of the Biden-Harris administration, including as acting Assistant Secretary and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategic Operations and Outreach. Ms. Goldberg brings to the Department of Education extensive experience in civil rights leadership with special expertise in gender and sexuality law, along with many years of experience as a university administrator and faculty member. Ms. Goldberg has also served as a guest teacher on civil rights issues in elementary and secondary schools. Before joining the U.S. Department of Education, she was the inaugural Executive Vice President for University Life at Columbia University, where she worked to broaden and reinforce the university's commitment to student well-being, inclusion and belonging, and opportunities for addressing pressing issues across the university community. At Columbia Law School, Ms. Goldberg is on a public service leave from her role as the Herbert and Doris Wexler Clinical Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. Ms. Goldberg founded the law school's Sexuality and Gender Law Clinic, the first of its kind in the nation, and was co-founder and co-director of the law school's Center for Gender and Sexuality Law. Prior to joining Columbia Law School in 2006, she served on the faculty of Rutgers University School of Law in Newark, where she taught a variety of courses and directed the Women's Rights Litigation Clinic. During the 1990s, Ms. Goldberg served as an adjunct faculty member at Fordham Law School. She began her legal career as a staff attorney with Lambda Legal, the country's first and largest legal organization focused on achieving full equality for LGBTQ+ people. At Lambda, she worked on a wide variety of matters in immigration, employment discrimination, family law, and other fields, as well as 2 cases that became cornerstone gay rights victories at the US Supreme Court: Lawrence versus Texas, the landmark decision that struck down Texas's sodomy law, and Romer versus Evans, which overturned an anti-gay Colorado constitutional amendment. She is an award-winning teacher and recipient of Columbia Law School's Willis L.M. Reese Prize for Excellence in Teaching and has been named the Public Interest Professor of the Year. Ms. Goldberg has written extensively in academic journals and public media, including on discrimination law, sexuality and gender law, and issues related to free expression on campus. She served as a clerk to Justice Marie Garibaldi of the New Jersey Supreme Court, and prior to law school was a Fulbright Fellow at the National University of Singapore. Ms. Goldberg holds a law degree with honors from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree with honors from Brown University. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Suzanne Goldberg.
Thank you so much, Ma. And I'm so glad to be here with all of you this morning. It's just fantastic to see a room full of people focused on engaging and supporting and educating, right, our English learners. And it's really, who are such a fundamental part of the American school system and the future of the nation. So really, thank you for being here. I guess I should have added to my bio maybe one important qualification that isn't there, which is that my mother for many years has worked with English learners as adults in a variety of settings. So I was sort of party to her, listening to her as she was gaining her education in English language teaching. And so although I have a glancing idea, at least, of some of the concepts and the work that colleagues here do. Also, I should mention that when I was in the 1990s, when I was a staff lawyer with Lambda Legal working on LGBT issues, I co-founded an organization called Immigration Equality that still is dedicated to supporting LGBTQ plus immigrants and immigrants with HIV in the United States, especially working on asylum, but other issues as well. So my plan is to talk for a bit and hopefully not too long, and then also to try to be sure to leave time for questions and your thoughts. You know as well as I that our nation derives its strength from all of the people in it. And all of the people in it very much includes our English learner students, their English learner families, family members, and really the communities that surround and support every newcomer to the United States. We have excelled, right? You don't need me to tell you this, but we have excelled because of the diversity of our nation. And in fact, to me, the work you do in ensuring that every student has opportunity is the work that truly ensures the future of this country. So thank you so much. I want to also affirm for you that the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights has our lights on. We are here. We are receiving complaints. We are responding to complaints. And also, and I think as importantly, we are doing all we can to provide you with the information, the support, the questions and answers, the guidance that may be helpful to you in supporting full access for English learners. And so I guess my homework for you, or my ask for you, is that if there are materials or questions that you have or things that you think would be useful for us to address in a fact sheet, please do let us know at the Office for Civil Rights. It'd be very, very helpful to us because we really want to be responsive to you. Now, you probably know some of what I'm about to share, but I guess you can consider this the reinforcement of things you know, and then hopefully there will be some information that may be less familiar. So the Office for Civil Rights, OCR for short, our mission is to ensure equal access to education and to promote educational excellence throughout the nation through rigorous enforcement of civil rights. In particular, as you probably know, we enforce a range of laws. The one that is most familiar to you, I'm guessing, is Title VI, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin, and includes protections for English learners. We also enforce Title IX, which prohibits sex discrimination. We enforce two disability laws, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, as well as Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And part of what I want to spend time on is the intersection of Title VI and Section 504, or really how to support English learners with disabilities. So how do we do the work we do? What do we do? I think you know, but again, we receive about 10,000 complaints a year, and about half of them are related to disability. About a quarter are under Title VI, and a quarter are under Title IX. That's rough numbers. And of course, some overlap, and certainly we have seen many. In fact, we've recently resolved some complaints involving English learners with disabilities who didn't have full access to educational opportunity. In addition to the enforcement arm, and as important is the work that we do to provide guidance and education, one to the general public, and then two to you, right? To people who are doing the work in schools, and it's our responsibility to make sure that this education, this guidance work is as clear and as useful and as responsive to the kinds of questions you ask as it can be. In addition, we do provide sort of more formal technical assistance. And then the other major piece of work, which hopefully you know about, is our civil rights data collection. I think of that as our national gem. There's certainly a lot of information related to English learners there. If you don't know what it is, let me just tell you very quickly. This is a data collection that OCR has been collecting for decades now. And we look at access and opportunity and barriers to opportunity in K-12 public schools throughout the United States. And so we collect information, for example, about what percentage of students are English learners, what percent, we collect all sorts of demographic information. We collect information about what do the profiles of students look like who are taking algebra, who are taking advanced placement classes. How many full-time teachers does a school have? What are the chronic absenteeism rates? So really a range of issues so that for any school in the country, by looking at, if you Google CRDC and Department of Education or OCR, you'll find it. You can really see both the profile of your school and any neighboring schools. And if you went to public school in the United States, you can, and you've never been to the CRDC website, the first thing you might want to do is look up where you went to school and see what it looks like there. But it's very important for us in OCR because it shows us spaces where students have disparate, it illuminates disparities, number one, but number two, shows us where there is need, shows us where there is need for enforcement. For example, there may be situations, and there typically are, where we see significant disparities in the use of discipline against students based on race, which can raise concerns, but also shows us where we need to be sort of adding more support. So before I dive into what we're doing with respect to English learner students, I want to give you a feel for what we've done in the Biden-Harris administration since day one. And I did arrive in the office on day one. I was sworn in shortly after President Biden was sworn in, and have been thrilled to be at OCR and at the Department of Education since that moment. For me, it's a dream to be there. So one of the, and in fact, a day one directive to OCR as part of President Biden's school reopening executive order was to issue a report on the disparate impacts of the pandemic on students across the United States. And so what did that mean for us? It meant that we looked, I mean, we don't have an independent research arm, but we took a snapshot of the research in that moment, right? So in that sort of first months of January 2021, and asked, what do we see here in terms of disparities? And we looked at K-12 and then higher ed. And what we saw won't surprise any of you. And in fact, you just mentioned it, which is that the students who are English learners experienced tremendous harms associated with the shutdown of schools and lack of the shift to remote learning and lack of access to in-person schooling during the pandemic. I really encourage you to take a look at the report if you're interested. It's called, excuse me, Education in a Pandemic: The Disparate Impacts of COVID-19 on America's Students. And again, you can Google Education in a Pandemic and OCR or Department of Education, and I think that will get you there. One of the main points that we try, or really a framing point that we tried to stress in the discussion of the report, or in the way the report sort of presents information, is to make clear, right, these disparities did not start with a pandemic. Right. Instead, what the pandemic has done, I know you all know this, is to exacerbate and amplify disparities. And so the report may be useful to you because you can see both the pre-pandemic data on pre-pandemic disparities and on disparities at the time of the report. You may also find it interesting because you'll see the crossover and the sort of experiences of other students who have in particular been hardest hit by the pandemic: students of color, students with disabilities, LGBTQI+ students, students who are parents, and more. In addition, it was very important to us when we got started joining the administration to make sure that, to the extent we could, both educators and the public had as much information as possible about civil rights and school reopening. So one of the first things we did was to issue a question and answer on civil rights and school reopening. And that has two purposes, really, from my perspective. One, and most fundamentally, is to provide answers to the questions we were getting, like, what are the rights of English learner students when school is either remote or going back in person, and a range of other issues, many related to students with disabilities, but we cover Title VI, Title IX, and the disability laws there. The other was the title, to make the point that when we think about school reopening, we of course think about safe spaces, we think about testing, we think about masking, we think about all of the ways we mitigate safety risk, physical safety risk, but we also have to think about civil rights, right? That civil rights are as much part of the school infrastructure as the other things that we think about, right? Books and, maybe people still use pens and pencils. I don't know. I do, but laptops or whatever the device is. Point being that we can't think about school without thinking about access, right? And what is the foundation? What gives the right to access? It's of course the civil rights laws that OCR enforces. And very importantly, it's your knowledge that you bring into the school environment to say, this is what the students need. And not only do they need it because it may be a moral or an ethical obligation and a learning obligation, it's also a legal obligation for schools. We also issued fact sheets on, for example, COVID-19 related harassment, really dedicated to alerting students and families about anti-Asian targeting and harassment related to COVID-19 and how to get support and help and what kinds of instances or incidents OCR might be able to investigate. We issued a similar fact sheet on combating discrimination related to LGBTQI+ students. Confronting discrimination based on national origin and immigration status. I don't expect you to see this from there. I'm just holding it up. Shortly after a court opinion was issued challenging certain aspects of DACA, the DACA program, we issued a blog post in English and in Spanish that reinforced the right of access of all students to K-12 public schools, regardless of immigration status and regardless of English learner status, and the obligation of schools to provide students with resources and support and education. Okay, so we've done a lot, but those are some basics, and I hope they give you a picture of some of the work that the Office for Civil Rights has been doing. So let me turn now more specifically to access related to immigration status, to supports for English learners, and the crossover for students with disabilities who are also English learners to ensure that they have full access to their education. Now, and I know you all know this, but under law, public elementary and secondary schools are available to all students who are residing in the United States without regard to immigration status. A school can never require a student or their family member to show proof of citizenship or anything like that, for example, to enroll. This includes students who are legally authorized immigrants and students who are not, right? All students residing in the United States have a right to attend school, and if they're English learners, they have a right to have a full education in addition to support for their English learning, right? So the simply put point there is that students who are English learners must also be free from discrimination based on their proficiency in English, or if they are refugees based on their refugee status, or whatever the circumstances are that led to their arrival in the United States. So what resources do we have for you? Maybe I could just ask, how many of you have been working in this field for more than 3 years? Okay, so I'm telling you nothing you don't know. Apologies, maybe just consider this part a little bit of a refresher. But I'll just remind you that you know the resources, hopefully, that we have for you. Hopefully you heard about the August 21 fact sheet that tries to lift up and simplify what the rights are of what the rights are of students to access school and access language services in school, and what the rights are of families in that same sense. Part of what I think is very important for the Office for Civil Rights in these times when there's been some quiet on some of these issues is to make sure that we keep saying this, right? Is to make sure that we reiterate, we make the information accessible, and that confronting discrimination based on national origin and immigration fact sheet that I mentioned is one that we translated into many languages, and after Afghans started arriving in the United States, translated into Dari and Pashto as well, to try to really get the word out, not only among educators who presumably know what these rights and obligations are, but also among students and their families. You know that we have a Dear Colleague letter, probably all of you know this, from back in 2014 on student enrollment procedures that provides guidance about non-discrimination, a Q&A resource related to that as well. You know that we have released fact sheets, and back in 2015, the Department of Education issued a major report that I think many are a sort of compilation of information that many of you, I'm sure you, or I hope use. But if you haven't looked at it lately, let me encourage you to look at it again, called Supporting Undocumented Youth, a Guide for Success in Secondary and Post-Secondary Settings. You know, and of course, you know, we are in a different world from the one we're in 2015, particularly in terms of the pressures and stress on students who don't have documentation to remain in the country and their families, but it's still a useful resource. And then with respect to English learner students, you know, and I'll just say again out loud, right, that schools not only have the obligation to educate their students, but also to make information accessible to families in a language that the families can understand. And although all of you know this, I will say from my perspective at OCR that it is not a small number of complaints that we receive from parents and from guardians and advocates saying they're not getting this information in a language they understand. And this was particularly true, or particularly, I think, challenging, I guess I would say, when schools started ramping down from in-person learning and going remote, where a lot of schools were scrambling, they were communicating in English and not necessarily providing information to their English learner students and parents with limited English proficiency. And so what that meant, as I think you well know, is that the challenge was sort of baked in, right? If parents weren't getting or guardians weren't getting the information that they needed to support their students in getting online, those students were already starting sort of way behind the curve. And so as we move forward out of well, hopefully out of the pandemic or to a new phase of the pandemic, as Secretary Cardona often says, and I'm sure you've heard here and elsewhere, right? We don't want to just rebuild the same thing we have. We want to build back better, to use a familiar phrase. But what that means in the context of education and in the context of student civil rights is that we know there are problems, right? We know there are disparities. How can we coming back, ensure that we are thinking about access from the ground up, right? That's the civil rights infrastructure point, that we are building in the protections from the start so that all information the school is at, you know, the school, and this is sort of for you to write, and I'm sure you do this, raise with all of the schools wherever, or in the schools you're working in, or in the districts where you're working, or in the states where you're working, to build it in, right? To remind the people whose day-to-day work is outside of this, you know, what's the checklist, right? One of the pieces on the checklist is, has the information been communicated in languages that are used by all of the parents and guardians in the district, or sponsors in the district who don't speak English or are not going to understand the English materials in English? All right, I could go on about that, but let me keep talking about, move us over to the intersection of for English students who are English learners and our students with disabilities. So you know as well, these students have rights under several laws, right? Not only under Title VI, but also under Section 504 and maybe under the Americans with Disabilities Act. In addition, they may be eligible for services, special education services through an individualized education plan under the IDEA. OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, doesn't enforce the IDEA. That's a grants program that our colleagues in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services enforce. But there are civil rights issues related to students who have an IEP plan, which include ensuring that those students have their right of access, their rights enforced. So what are the rights? I think you know this. Again, let me actually ask another question of you. How can I ask? I guess we're too big a room to ask sort of what percentage of your students who are English learners are also students with disabilities who have a 504 or 504 plan or an IEP. I'm just gonna guess that in most schools, it's not a small number. And I think I would guess secondarily that if it is a small number, that's probably a sign that there's not enough work being done to locate and identify and assess students who may have disabilities. I'm not making a judgment about any particular school system, of course, but we know that our public school system in general has many students with disabilities. And so where there's a sharp disparity between the number of or percentage of students with disabilities who are not English learners and those who are English learners, it at least raises a question whether there's enough being done to assess. And by contrast, if there's a very high percentage of students who are English learners with disabilities, I'll get to your question in just, I will go to Q&A. Sorry? Oh, right. So you know, this is like the converse problem, right? This is interesting. Why in our school would we have a greater percentage of students who are English learners who have been identified as students with disabilities than students who are not in the English learner programs who have been identified as students with disabilities? Why would that disparity be? It doesn't sort of in the way of the world. There's not data, at least that I'm aware of, that would suggest that students with disabilities are disproportionately found in English learner programs or have also identified as English learners. So what does that tell us? I mean, we don't know, right? Any particular situation, you would have to do an investigation, but you might ask, right? The question in that setting would be, are we assessing students properly? Why is it that when we are assessing students, our English learner students, more of them are identified as students with disabilities? Maybe we're not assessing properly. Maybe what we're doing is assessing in a way that that picks up a student's English language skills rather than their academic level, or rather than other barriers to education that would be addressed by our disability laws. And so if you can see that, it's not really crossover, but those two different kinds of questions, I think they're very useful questions to go back to the school, to the district, to the state, and ask, what do our numbers look like? And if they're pretty different, why is that? Because that's sort of an important question, not just for you to be asking, but then for you to make sure that others are asking as well. So what are the basic rights? I'm sure you know this, but the students with Section 504 requires all recipients of federal funds in education programs or activities to provide students with disabilities with FAPE, right? FAPE. I know you know, but I'll just say it, free appropriate public education. And students are also entitled to receive that free appropriate public education in the general population setting to the greatest extent possible, right? With other students who are not students with disabilities to the greatest extent possible. So what does that mean? If students with disabilities who are English learners are automatically put off into a special class because they're students with disabilities, that's not okay. Why? Because our disability laws, not unlike our requirements related to English learners, require an individualized assessment, right? Not just what do all students with disabilities need, but what does this student with disabilities need, with a disability or multiple disabilities need? It's obvious to educators, right, that you can't, people are not, we're not like sort of cookies stamped out of a machine, right? We're all individuals, and to educate the student, we need to meet the student where they are. And the law requires that with respect to students with disabilities. Law not only requires that, but also requires schools to identify, to locate and identify, assess, and then provide an appropriate plan and implement that plan for students with disabilities, and then to periodically assess it. There are, sort of a range of issues. I don't have to go into the weeds on this one, but I think it's important to just be reminded of that. Of course, a parent has to consent. There are some issues if a parent does not consent. And how does the school figure out the plan? With a knowledgeable group of people, right? Not one person. It's supposed to be a group. It is supposed to be people who have different access to different information about the child. So in the case of an English learner with disabilities, that means you or people you work with who are focused on the English the students' needs and academic needs, as well as those who are knowledgeable about the students with the students' disabilities and what they need with respect to that. And it may be that that's all in the same person. It may be that you have all that information. Typically, those responsibilities, as you know, are lodged with different people. And so this is where, I guess what I would say is another kind of fundamental point when we think about school infrastructure is that we bake in the idea of partnership and collaboration. Because if different people have different expertise about different aspects of a child, and that child has rights under these various laws or has needs under these various laws, it's the school's obligation to make sure those are met. It's not the students or the parents or the guardian's problem to do the coordinating. So that obligation is on the school. Let me mention one other piece of information that we released recently in February 2022. I hope you saw it, but you may not have, so I want to bring it to your attention. And that is that we issued a fact sheet reminding schools of their obligations to ensure, not only ensure FAPE, right, ensure free appropriate public education under Section 504, but also within that to provide compensatory services for students who did not receive that free appropriate public education during the pandemic shutdowns, right? So when students have a right to compensatory services, let's say maybe it's a student who needed an evaluation, right? Or needed to be reevaluated because something related to the placement changed, which was true for many, many students whose learning environments changed. That evaluation, if it didn't take place, obviously has to take place, and as well as a determination about what might have been missed, to what extent were compensatory services required. And let me just flip to that. You can find it on OCR's website. It's called just, I'm sure we can circulate this after. It's just a fact sheet for providing students with disabilities free appropriate public education during the COVID-19 pandemic and addressing the need for compensatory services under Section 504. It's a pretty descriptive title, maybe not catchy, but descriptive. But what does it all mean? It means that the school has to consider what was the frequency and duration of the missed instruction or services? Where is the student now? Where had we expected them to be? If there's a gap, and for many students with disabilities, which is another group of students extremely hard hit by the pandemic, where the disparities worsened. So if there's a gap, and there often is, how do we address that gap, right? That's the question for the school, right? If were the special education or other services provided for the student during the pandemic shutdown or reopening or sporadic reopening period, were those appropriate, not just in general, but based on the student's needs, right? So we saw some school districts saying, well, we're gonna do this for all of our students with disabilities. And that's great. And there is also the obligation for the individualized assessment and then the individualized response, right? And so all of these things, all of these questions are the questions that need to be asked as we think about what are a school's obligations to students with disabilities and together with students who are English learners. And so I just want to make sure that in addition to all of the knowledge you already have, that you have in mind that compensatory services piece, right? The backward-looking question about what was missed, because even though, and as we fully acknowledge, all schools, virtually all schools, had a very tough time. All of us had a very tough time in the early months of the pandemic, and since throughout, many of us have suffered terrible losses and losses of loved ones, losses of jobs, losses of security, losses of what we knew as normal life. So even amidst those, there's not a judgment about the school was bad or good to have done this, but the legal obligation remains, and the laws, student civil rights don't kind of get paused because there has been a pandemic, right? The student is still growing up, the student is still being educated, and so compensatory services are part of the obligation. So let me just close by highlighting, re-raising the question that I identified as the homework question for you, which is, what else do you need from us at the Office for Civil Rights? What are the questions that you have? What is the information? I'll come to the actual questions in a second, but I'm interested not just right now, but longer term. So if there are questions that you think we may not be able to answer them instantly, but you think we ought to address, you can actually just send them to me. You could just write to me at suzanne.goldberg@ed.gov, or you can share them through OELA, which is probably the sensible way to do this so that we can stay coordinated. I'm looking at Supreet and she's saying, yes, send them to OELA. OELA is the better place to send your questions, and we will collaborate as we do across the department in ensuring that you, to the extent we can, that you have what you need. I want to flag one other resource for you that I would encourage you to turn to, and we call them for short our virtual binders. So these are a compilation of all sorts of civil rights resources for K-12 schools. How do you find them? Well, if you've ever gone on OCR's website, you know it has room for improvement. I'll just say that. So it's not always easy to find things, but if you Google OCR and virtual binders, that should bring you to a blog post where you can find an easy link to your virtual binder. And that includes every resource that we think, virtually all resources that we think would be helpful for people working in K-12 schools or K-12 educational settings for under Title VI, Title IX, our disability laws, as well as information about the civil rights data collection. That's kind of a one-stop shop. And if you could do one thing for me, it would be to find that virtual binder and share it around in your district or with your colleagues or wherever you are in whatever setting. So OCR remains fully, energetically, enthusiastically committed to ensuring civil rights for all students, including very much our English learners, all of them, and their families, including all who recently arrived in the United States and all who have been here for much longer. Critical to us that they be able to access fully the opportunities that public education has to offer, and that they receive language services, that they receive information about these services in a language that they can understand. As Secretary Cardona said, and I imagine somebody else has already quoted this, so consider this extra spotlights. We will work to ensure the nation's public schools, colleges, and universities will be welcoming, safe, and supportive places where all students, regardless of where they're born and their immigration status, are given the opportunity to succeed. I can't think of a better way to put it. So let me stop there and take a few minutes for your questions. Thank you very much for engaging with me today. And I thought I saw a hand up. Oh, right, there's a, great.
There we go. All right. Good morning. Thank you, Pam. So good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. Very helpful. I'm curious about the provision of Title III funds, which are federal flow-through grants to SEAs to administer to LEAs. And Title III has affordances for use in dual language education. However, dual language education, if it is a two-way model, is a proportional blend of English majority and language minoritized students. And my concern is that this is evolving into a form of misuse of Title III funds. It's something that I've started to discover in my particular context. It is not something that districts advertise, and it's certainly not something that the EL field is advertising, because once it's out there, it will happen in great frequency. So I'm curious about that piece, because you have this purposeful blending and we have integrated classrooms, so certainly that's the case. But if you have one emergent bilingual in a dual language classroom, are we subverting funds away from maybe other non-dual language ESL spaces for dual language? So I'm curious if that's being investigated.
Thank you. That is a great question. One of the things that I learned in law school and was reinforced to me as a lawyer is that if you don't know the answer, probably shouldn't speculate about it. I think I've written your question down, and maybe Disparate can actually address it. We don't do grants administration in the Office for Civil Rights, but I think it's but duly noted. And I will take it back to others who may be able to address that in more depth, and maybe Disparate will be able to do that in her, I know she's giving remarks next, so maybe that will follow. So thank you for the question. It's a very
Can I
important
ask
one.
a quick another one?
Sure,
we
and I
have
think what
another
I'm
one?
going to do is,
No.
since we have several people lined up and I know just a couple of minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, was that my wave? So if what I'll try to do is get to all questions as quickly as I can. I'll go ahead.
Yes, thank you.
And if you want to
very-
introduce yourself, please do.
Okay, my name is Janice Koch. I'm an evaluator on 2 Texas A&M grants for the last 5 years. First of all, thank you for your remarks, and I'm so glad your position exists. So it was really helpful. I'm interested in understanding if the Office for Civil Rights is investigating, has authority to investigate the intersection between English language learners and the LGBTQ community, especially as it relates to the laws that are being passed, not enacted yet, in the state of Florida.
Great, thank you. I'm going to write down all the questions and then I'll
Thank you.
I'll address them quickly. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you so much for the resources that you shared with us and for the encouraging words and for the attention to all these very important issues. My name is Under Hellman, and I'm a teacher educator in Missouri. And the question I'd like to bring to you is that my students who are in-service teachers of English learners share a lot of critical incident scenarios with me. And many of those critical incident scenarios involve children's civil rights. And so I'd like to know what is the best answer that I can give to teachers, because I understand in previous talks, we were told, well, you have to encourage parents to contact the Office of Civil Rights, and that's the best course of action. But the teachers feel that that is a whistleblowing action in their school. So how should I respond to teachers who bring critical incidents to me that I know require action?
Great. Thank you very much for your question. Go ahead. And let me.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me? Okay, yeah, that's really loud. Okay, basically, I just had questions in terms of maybe having some proactive statements from OCR to sort of help guide schools in terms of, there's a few things, but the ones that strike me most are what to do with scripted curriculum, because we've had incidents of scripted curriculum where they're so hung up on fidelity to the model that they punish teachers for giving our ELs the visuals, the graphic organizers that they need in order to understand. So maybe a statement about scripted curriculum to help guide the schools, because they're doing things out of standardization and they're not understanding what's needed. And then the other thing has to do with, and I don't know if this is a big issue, but I've heard that kids who are ESL and are also SPED are taken out of ESL and put in SPED. And so I just want to make sure that kids get everything that they need. And that is just something, again, that my teachers are whispering in my ears. And then the last one is very specific. It's ELs who aren't allowed to go into other language immersions. So they're forced into the two-way immersion, even though they want to do Mandarin immersion or they want to do French immersion, but they're forced into the two-way immersion. So.
Great. Thank you. And I see I'm getting the yellow wrap up sign. So I see somebody with a microphone in her hand.
One
So
more.
if you could say sort of 15
It's
seconds,
gonna be
I'll
short.
speak for a minute. Yeah.
Norma Hernandez, thank you very much for speaking today. I have a question about the 180 days that people have to file a complaint. And there is something on your website that says, if there's reason why you didn't, can you tell me how many people who asked for that waiver beyond the 180 days actually get it granted, and what advice? Because I work
Great.
with some families that it takes them 180 days just to understand the process.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. I'm setting my timer. If I take 90 seconds to is that okay?
But I can do mine in 5 seconds. For those of us in states where there's no requirement for ELL teachers to be certified, is that an OCR issue that can be taken up? Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to talk, this is lightning round. So apologies for speed. The civil rights laws don't speak to teacher certification rules if there's a reason. So I think that I haven't looked into that question, but they really don't address that as far as I'm aware. In terms of the 180 days, we certainly do allow complaints, grant the waiver when it is requested. And what is that? That is sort of, we typically require within 6 months of the incident, the discrimination, for the complaint to be filed. There are some instances where, for extreme circumstances, that wasn't possible. So it's truly case by case. And the complainant, the person who files the complaint, can always speak with the person who responds to their complaint and asks them questions about the waiver to try to have a conversation about it and go further there. Students being taken out of class, right? EL students being taken out of class, not given their English learner services, given disability related services. That's a deny. I mean, I can't speak for every case, but in principle, students must have both. Right? It's not either or. The student is one person. They have rights under both laws. To deprive a student of part of their education is to violate the civil rights laws, depending on the facts. What to do with scripted curriculum? I think that's a great question. I will just bring it back. I'm going to come back to the second question in a moment. What about English learners who are LGBTQ plus? Well, we know many LGBTQ plus students are really just astonishingly targeted right now by hostile laws. This administration has been 100% supportive consistently of LGBTQ plus students, their families, teachers. President Biden on Transgender Day of Visibility, which was last Thursday, issued a proclamation and a short video. So did Secretary Cardona. So I would encourage you to look at that. I would also encourage you to go to OCR's website and just look for LGBTQI plus resources, where we have a lot for you. And of course, there are LGBTQI plus students who are English learners, and some of their family members who have limited English proficiency are LGBTQI plus. Again, people are whole human beings and have rights under all of our laws. And then what's the best answer to teachers who are coming and saying, look, I've heard about this discrimination? And certainly speaking to the parent or the guardian is very important, and educating them on the process. I also want you to be aware that OCR doesn't have a limitation on who can bring a complaint to us. So anybody, and people do, anybody can bring a complaint to OCR if you have a concern that civil rights are being violated. And how do you file a complaint? You can just Google OCR and how to file a complaint, and that will bring you to our online complaint form and a lot of other information. Thank you for indulging me for the extra minutes. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with all of you this morning. Have a great conference.
Let's give another round of applause to Suzanne. Thank you so much, Suzanne. This has been great, great. I think it's also affirmation for us that OCR is back. All right, let me just get my act together here. Should work. All right, so what I'm going to do is share some information, some resources that we think might be helpful, useful to you in framing your work. And also maybe some of the data and information could also help you, advocate for your MOUs and recruitment of your teachers and, other things that I know are challenges when we're trying to implement our NPD program. So let me just get started in the essence of time. So what I want to first acknowledge, like you've heard everybody else, is that the pandemic has had a significant impact on all our students' learning and has widened pre-existing opportunities and achievement gaps, hitting historically underserved students the hardest. To fix all of that, we have to first understand it. So we know that American funds are in place, the American Rescue Funds you heard Roberto talk about yesterday. They're in place to help states and districts respond, but we know that funding is not the only answer. But we also know that we have the opportunity now to not only help students catch up on the unfinished learning from the pandemic, but also tackle some long-standing historical inequities in education that the pandemic kind of brought to the surface. So if anybody hadn't seen them or heard about them before, they should by now, right? And you all play a critical role in preparing educators and building those partnerships with districts to promote sustainable programs that improve outcomes for our multilingual learners. So first I'm going to talk about the impact on all these kind of 4 different levels or 4 different perspectives. So this was one of the resources that Suzanne talked about. In January 2021, OCR published a report on the disparate impact of the pandemic on underserved student groups. If you haven't had a look at it, please do. It's very informative. We know that evidence was already mounting that English learners have been among one of the student groups that have been the hardest hit by the COVID-19 disruptions to in-person learning, but we can't ignore the deep-rooted challenges that students classified as English learners are facing in our nation's schools, and the fact that those predate the pandemic and have resisted many reform efforts. So as schools build back from the pandemic, districts are recommitting to providing high quality instruction to every student. And this requires understanding the root causes for the outcome disparities that affect our multilingual learners and identifying the malleable factors that can mitigate those disparities. So we know that districts are redoubling efforts in many places to provide engaging, high-quality, grade-level curriculum and instruction delivered by diverse and effective educators in every classroom, while also committing to new and innovative approaches to engaging students based on lessons learned from those hybrid learning models and other models that we've had to switch back and forth to. But as the school year draws to a close, districts are taking stock of the impact of the unfinished learning on students and evaluating both traditional approaches and innovative new approaches designed for learning recovery. Teachers and administrators will be transforming data into information and transforming information into decisions about students. And we all play a critical role in preparing our educators to engage in culturally responsive data literacy. We need to promote data literacy and increase the capacity of the education workforce to engage in data responsive and culturally responsive data articulation and promote educator dispositions to recognizing that the academic achievement of ethically diverse students will improve when academic knowledge and skills are taught through methods that honor their frames of reference and assume that district and school staff have control over the malleable factors that impact student achievement. You heard from our presenters yesterday, Andrea, talk about how teachers were feeling powerless. And we have to empower our teachers with factors that are within their control. And some of those malleable factors are within their control. We have to engage our students in those conversations and make them feel empowered to be able to have those conversations when it comes to data and the type of instruction that they can offer. So let's look at some of the data. Look at the data from IES, the Educational Institute, to help us understand the teaching and learning environments during the post-pandemic. So in preparation for the administration of NAEP, everybody knows, the National Assessment of Education Programs, NAEP assessment, we waived the NAEP assessment for last year, and instead, NCES conducted a pre-assessment activity, which included a wide variety of school surveys. So in 2021, NCES used this data to create 2 new experimental data products, which are innovative statistical products created using new data sources or methodologies. So let me see, go back to that. Okay. Experimental data may not meet all of the NCES quality standards, but are of sufficient benefit to data users in the absence of other relevant products. So these school survey dashboards, if you haven't had a look at it, have incredibly useful information in helping us understand the conditions in the learning environment over the last 2 years. The link included in this slide will give you access to the dashboard, where month by month from January 21 to May 21, data was collected on 4th and 8th grade students about the mode of instruction offered, enrollment, student attendance, and which student group received priority for in-person instruction. So when we start looking at this data, I'm just giving you snapshots of a couple of the slides, couple of the data points, sorry. So from January to May 2021, NCES collected data from schools about a variety of issues, including to what degree did schools offer remote, hybrid, or full-time in-person instruction? What was the proportion of students overall and by various student groups enrolled in these instructional modes? What was the attendance rate for each of these instructional mode, and which student groups received priority for in-person instruction? So this chart here shows enrollment rates by modes offered for students in grade 4. So as you can see here, in January 2021, 53% of English learners in grade 4 enrolled in remote programs, 12% were enrolled in hybrid programs, and 34% were enrolled in in-person programs. So majority of our students were still being offered remote instruction. one of the many data points collected was which student groups received priority for in-person instruction. And in this data set, what you see is in May of 2021, 39% of participating schools prioritized English learners for in-person instruction. So only 39%. By May 2021, we saw that there was an increase in grade 4 English learners enrolled in in-person instruction from 34% to 46% in May. And before we go on to examine data from IES for the current school year, let's take a look at the impact of unfinished learning on our students. So this data actually comes from an article by McKinsey and Company, and you can have full access to this article and various other data points used with the links on these slides. So to access student learning through the pandemic, McKinsey and Company analyzed assessment results of more than 1.6 million elementary students across the nation, across 40 states, on the iReady in-school assessment, which is a web-based adapted diagnostic assessment by Curriculum Associates. They compared student performance in the spring of 2021 with the performance of similar students prior to the pandemic, and found that in this cohort of students, was 5 months behind in mathematics and 4 months behind in reading, compared with where we would have expected them to be based on historical data. So while all students experienced unfinished learning, some student groups were disproportionately affected. Students of color, low-income students suffered the most. Students in majority Black schools ended the school 6 months behind in both reading and math, while students in majority white schools ended up 4 months behind in math and 3 months behind in reading. Students in predominantly low-income schools and in urban locations also lost more learning during the pandemic than their peers in high-income rural and suburban schools. So this shows in some very tangible ways that unfinished learning is real and it's inequitable. We know that students didn't just lose academic learning during the pandemic. Some lost family members, others had caregivers who lost their jobs and sources of income, and almost all experienced social isolation. So when we examine the academic data, because we know that there are long-term consequences to unfinished learning, we must also address and know to avoid exasperating achievement gaps and socioeconomic gaps for our English learners and other underserved student groups and communities. So I encourage you to read this article and relevant data on the impact of unfinished learning. They have some really good insights into the impact and very tangible ways that they explain it. Moving along on the impact on teachers. So on January 2022, 97% of public schools offered full-time in-person instruction. So this is 22, moving a year forward, while 40% still offered remote and 7% offered hybrid instruction. So IES developed their second innovative experimental data product, which is called the School Pulse Survey, which explores single-month topics to provide insights into learning and teaching conditions during 21-22 school year. So by single topics, I mean that each month they focused on one specific area to explore. So the focus topic for this past of January 2022 was staffing. So again, there is a plethora of information to examine using this link. Today, I'm just going to look at a few data points relevant to staffing and the impact on teaching and learning environment. So the School Pulse Survey, it's like a tongue twister, asked schools the extent to which they agree with the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the number of teachers and staff vacancies in their school. So it was, to what extent do you agree with those statements? This dashboard allows us to examine the responses by the reporting categories on the upper right hand that you see on this chart by region, school location, socioeconomic levels, race, ethnicity, school level, school size. So those are the different ways that you can disaggregate this data. This chart shows a response by school level. So I just took one of those categories to kind of show you what you can explore. So as you can see, 61% of schools across all levels agree that COVID-19 impacted or increased the number of teachers and staff vacancies in their schools. The highest percentage, 65%, was at the middle school level. So that's something to note as you are partnering with schools and working to prepare your teachers across the K through 12 continuum. This chart examines the impact of staff vacancies on schools, teachers, and classrooms. The data is displayed by column representing school levels, all elementary, middle, and high. The rows represent various areas of impact, such as increase in class size, increasing need or the use of teachers outside of their intended duties. And we see that impact on our ESL teachers disproportionately. I believe AFT has published a survey that they conducted of their teachers and principals, and it's available on Colored Colorado. It's also very interesting data to look at how teachers, our ESL teachers, were being used outside of their classrooms during the school day, which of course then takes away from instruction, right? Also, data disaggregated by increased need to use non-teaching staff outside of their intended duties and offering fewer services to students. So this heat map chart shows that the darker cells indicate the higher percentages. The darkest rows shows the most impact reported of the increased need to use teachers outside of their intended duties. And specifically at the middle school level, this response was up to 67%. So when you delve deeper into this data, you can see some patterns where how middle school teachers are being treated, the type of situations they are being put in, and then you see the staff shortages being exacerbated at the middle school level. Not making any correlations here, but it's just hard to miss. We've been hearing how principals, superintendents, and bus drivers have stepped in to support instruction in the classroom. We recently heard how in New Mexico, for example, it's become the first state to mobilize the National Guard to step into the classroom as substitute teachers to provide instruction. And I think that just speaks to the desperation of our school systems. And while, yes, you get the bodies in the classroom, but remember, all of these folks, including our bus drivers and our principals, have been out of the classroom for a long time and are not necessarily ready to, step into a teaching role. Teachers train and do this every day, and the right people to be in the classroom. So while, yes, we're putting bodies in the classroom, but the instruction is not up to mark. So we are very concerned about that. So the staffing crisis is affecting districts across the country, but impacting some schools with higher enrollment of minority students more than others. This chart shows the percentage of public school by proportion of teacher and staff vacancies, listed as rows from 0% vacant to more than 10% vacant. The columns representing the school proportion of students by race and ethnicity, by Black, Hispanic, you see all of those races. This heat map shows that the darkest rows, the cells show the highest percentage of vacancies. The left-hand side of the chart shows teaching vacancies, while the right-hand shows non-teaching vacancies. So what we see from this data is that schools with the higher percentages of minority students have higher percentages of more than 10% vacancies. Our most underserved students are experiencing the highest rate of turnover in staffing. We need to partner with our schools and districts most affected by this challenge and support our teacher preparation and retention efforts while promoting culturally responsive learning environment. And I want to underscore the importance of retention of our teachers. If we continue to not provide the professional atmosphere that our teachers need to work in, we are going to continue to be behind the 8 ball in recruiting teachers because more and more teachers are leaving. So retention has to be at par with recruitment. We can't just keep recruiting. We got to retain the talent we have. So this abrupt shift to remote learning started at the start of the pandemic, brought learning environments into the home and quickly increased parent involvement and with it accountability to high quality remote learning. We know that the US education system was not built to deal with extended shutdowns like those imposed by COVID-19. Teachers, administrators, and parents have worked hard to keep learning alive. Nevertheless, for many students, these efforts did not provide the quality of education that can be delivered in the classroom. The need for our families in our community to know how their schools are doing and the ability to look transparently at the progress that our schools are making is not going away. Family engagement that leads to student success develops the capacity of the family to be decision makers in their educational options for their teachers and to be collaborators with school staff and members of the community on issues of school improvement. The IES School Pulse Survey for March, this March that just passed last month, the survey data will provide findings on parent concerns. So when this data is available, we will dig deep into it and understand the concerns and the recommendations from our families across the country. And we will continue to engage with our partners in the field, such as Californians Together, Council of Great City Schools, to learn about how they are engaging with parent in their communities. So we want to kind of continue to bring that data to you. And we will do that either in the form of a short meeting on Teams or somehow, be able to get these pulse surveys as they come in every month and share the outcomes with you, because I think you might find it relevant. So we need to increase or to include robust parent engagement component in our teacher preparation and development programs. I think the pandemic highlighted that aspect for us as parents were put into positions of becoming the teachers for their children, and married parents were able to step up, and many parents struggled with that new role. So family engagement initiatives are often predicated on a fundamental assumption that the educators and the families charged with developing effective partnerships between home and school already possess the requisite skills, knowledge, and confidence, and most importantly, belief systems. So in other words, the collective capacity to successfully implement and sustain these important homeschool relationships. But in reality, we know that's not the case. Many of our educators don't have the requisite skills, and many of our parents also struggle to figure out how to engage with the school. So this framework that I'm sharing with you is part of a publication. Many of you may be familiar with it, but I wanted to highlight it for you. It's titled Partners in Education, a Dual Capacity Building Framework for Family School Partnerships. This publication was developed in collaboration with the Southeast Educational Development Lab, which is funded by the US Department of Education. An updated version of this framework can be found at the dualcapacity.org website, and a full report on it can be found on ERIC. This framework emphasizes some key concepts. First, that family engagement that leads to student success develops the capacity of families to be decision makers in the educational options of their children and to be collaborators with school staff and members of the community on issues of school improvement. School staff develop the capacity to provide equitable services to diverse communities when they are aware of and value and adapt to the diversity among the communities that they serve. Reciprocal communication, where schools share information with and receive information from families, can enhance the capacity of schools to be proactive and culturally responsive. And what we also found during the pandemic is that schools that had this kind of reciprocal relationship already in place, had trust established with the families and communities, had a much easier transition to online and remote work than those that did not. So a very, very important component as part of our education systems. And sometimes we see one-way communication where schools send information home, but we don't see structures and opportunities for reciprocal communication and transfer of funds of knowledge from the families designed to improve the school learning environment. So the goal of this framework is to develop capacities at both ends, in schools and with families, to have a two-way communication so that the ultimate objective or outcome of family engagement is student and school improvement. And that is the most important thing, is that we have to have an outcome. Why are we doing this school engagement, family engagement, or community engagement? What is the purpose of it? So at the end of the day, what we want to see as an end product or outcome is student and school improvement. So we must keep that in mind as we are setting up these structures or helping our teachers set up these structures. Now let's look at the administrative side of this. So administrators can ensure rigorous implementation of evidence-based initiatives while also piloting and tracking the impact of innovative new approaches. Although it is too early to fully assess the effectiveness of post-pandemic solutions to unfinished learning, the scope of action is already clear. The immediate imperative is to not only reopen schools and recover unfinished learning, but also to reimagine educational systems for the long term. We have this opportunity right now that we are rebuilding our schools. And as you've heard many others from the department say, our Secretary Cardona really wants to say, let's rebuild, but let's rebuild something better. Let's not race back to where we were. What are we doing? What are the lessons that we've learned? There are things that we know have worked very well during remote learning. We found certain aspects of parent outreach using phones and Zooms and other ways resulted in more parents being able to be active participants. Let's keep those lessons learned as we move back to whatever our new normal is going to be. So let's look at those lessons learned and what can we build from that. Many districts have already created innovative summer programs and hybrid year-round programs. Some of these innovations are born of necessity, have actually met some families' needs better. Continued experimentation and fine-tuning can bring the best of traditional and new approaches together. But it is unclear whether all these experiments will succeed, and school districts would have to monitor these closely. And that is where you all with your researcher hats can really play a big role and help us understand what is working and what is not in the field, and how we can scale programs and sunset the unsuccessful ones. More than ever before, we need strategic leadership and leaders who are grounded in theories of action, founded in research, aligned for rigorous outcomes, and rich in the variety of pathways for our English learner students towards those outcomes. Districts and schools are turning towards internal accountability, making sure all students are getting their needs met and thriving. And once again, data literacy is an undeniable skill needed for this critical work. So let's look at some of the challenges that administrators have faced in this past year or this past fall, and discuss some of the leadership actions to these challenges. So in October, the department published some guidance on supporting the school's emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs of students. It is a supplement to 3 handbooks the department had published during the pandemic, and you can access the PDF through this link. This resources highlighted 7 key challenges to providing schools or program-based mental health supports during early childhood, K through 12 schools and higher education settings, and presents 7 corresponding recommendations. It includes many examples of how these recommendations are being put into actions by schools and communities and states across the country. OELA is partnering with CCSSO and NIALPA, which is the Title III Directors Association, on a 12-session webinar series designed for states and districts focusing on equity for multilingual learners. We've been hearing firsthand from states and districts that in addition to the ongoing challenges of the pandemic, to continuity of learning and unprecedented staffing shortages, they're also encountering student attendance and behavioral issues, which I think many of you have talked about and are aware of. So as you build partnerships with districts and schools and provide professional learning to administrators, this resource can be very helpful to you in identifying leadership actions to address these social and emotional needs of the staff and students. I want to highlight a couple of recommendations from this handbook that can be uplifted in your conversations with the leadership development component in your grant, if you have one, or just in your conversations with the leaders at the school and district level. So at the start of the pandemic, we all recognized the challenges brought on by disruption to teaching and learning, and we uncovered inequities that were already in place. So the same is true for staff. So while illness, loss, socioeconomic challenges have taken their toll on staff, we can't ignore the fact that there are challenges today that existed for staff prior to the pandemic and that still need ongoing intervention. So these are a few examples of strategies. First is prioritizing collaboration or collaborative planning time for delivery of instruction. The handbook recommends using communities of practice or professional learning communities, which provide collaborative opportunities to engage in group learning focused on a common issue, and leverage grade level or department team level meetings to create small staff or support staff together as they learn. Collaborative planning is particularly critical for our multilingual learners because we need to leverage the collaborative expertise of content and language specialists to create and calibrate instructional environments that can provide a balance of rigor and support. So you can encourage district leaders who are calibrating their district level teacher activities to manage their workload and staffing to make sure that they continue to prioritize collaborative planning and professional learning for teachers who serve our multilingual learners. Secondly, this particular handbook recommends ensuring wage and that wage benefits are competitive. One of the examples highlighted in the handbook is ensuring that professionals serving children birth to 5, early childhood, are compensated competitively with kindergarten educator peers who are similarly qualified. Similarly, we need to advocate for ESL teachers and dual language specialists to be treated as professionals on par with their peers who are classroom teachers and content teachers. So these are some recommendations. So you feel comfortable, you can say the Fed said it, it's here, it's an example, and leverage that in your conversations. Third is focusing on effectiveness and efficiency, embracing the concept that more is not necessarily better. Consider investing in a small number of evidence-based practices that are matched explicitly to the needs of the community and have potential of impacting students and children with identified needs. One of the alarming trends that we are seeing is with all of these funds that are going down to the district levels. Many districts are reverting to buying more materials, books, curriculum. There is a big push by a lot of the big publishing companies to push their products as the answer to all the difficulties that school districts are having. And school districts are falling into that trap of then spending funds on buying more stuff that is not going to be useful to our students. So I just wanted to put that on your radar in your conversations, or any influence that you can have with the local districts to help them make those decisions in a way that is going to be actually effective and useful for our students. Research cited in this document shows that feeling competent is part of wellness. When educators feel they have the skills, resources, and supports to do their job, they feel less stress and are able to better meet the needs of their children, students, and families. And I think that you all are well aware of that, what that statement means. Come on. There we go. So the fallout of the pandemic threatened to depress this generation's prospects and constrict their opportunities far into adulthood. This ripple effect may undermine chances of attending college and ultimately having a fulfilling job and enabling them to support themselves and their families. But thanks to the concerted efforts by states and districts, the worst projections for learning outcomes this year may yet not have materialized for most students. However, students are still far behind when they need to, where they need to be, especially from our historically marginalized groups. But however, left unchecked, unfinished learning could have severe consequences for student opportunities and prospects in the long term. It could exact a heavy toll on our economy, and it's not too late to mitigate these threats now that we have a lot of funding in place. So I want to put that on your radar too, that the funding that is in place at the local district level right now, if you have any influence as part of the stakeholder groups working with the states and local districts, please try to influence the use of those funds in a strategic way for our English learners, for extended year programs, extended day programs, community schools. There are lots of good practices that are happening across the country that you can uplift as examples of how those funds can be used effectively. And use all of this data and projections as a way to frame that conversation, that if we don't do this now, the long-term consequences can be pretty dire for our students. Now, as schools pivoted from in-person to remote and back, they have unprecedented access to data that they're using in innovative ways to reimagine more engaging, accessible learning environment. Yet some districts are data-rich and information poor, because they lack the capacity to analyze the data in culturally responsive ways and make informed decisions about the malleable factors within their control that can impact the learning trajectory of our English learners. So we need to ask ourselves is, how can we prepare teachers and leaders for the critical work of recovering unfinished learning? What are the dispositions, knowledge, and skills that we need to build in this new normal into a well-rounded teacher and leader development program? With all these great sessions available to you this week, I'm sure that you will find resources and collaborations to support you in your work. I want to, of course, let you know that OELA is committed to supporting you in your work. And I want to share some additional resources that the department has that you might find useful. We know that professional learning is more effective when it's job embedded and sustained. So this means that it is customized for the participant in their context. It's collaboratively connected with the learning communities. It is sustainable and continuous. So as the pandemic unfolded, We have an unprecedented number of free resources and strategies that were made available for teachers. But yet what happened is that we threw a lot of stuff at the teachers and they got overwhelmed and were unprepared to be able to use all of this. So it's important to operationalize professional learning in a coherent way and to evaluate professional learning plans, to think about questions like, are teachers getting the just-in-time learning that they need? Are they implementing what they're learning? Is the implementation leading to improved results for our schools? So the Institution of Educational Sciences, IES, created a tool for evaluating professional learning, which is designed for states to be used as for building a shared responsibility and bringing together multidisciplinary teams to identify learning and resourcing needs. So I wanted to kind of leave that to you. There are also some additional guides from IES. I'm just going to go through those very quickly for you. The practice guides, facilitator guides that can be used to contextualize this guide for the audience in a way that connects with their context. I think that's the biggest thing that we found is, how do we make this contextual? Also wanted to provide you information from the National Research and Development Centers to improve education for secondary English learners. You heard Kim talk about those two centers that are being funded through IES. Look at the resources in these centers. They have some very tangible, malleable factors that are within our reach that we can change the trajectory for our English learners as we continue to improve our education systems. Yeah. Now I want to turn it over to Dr. Elizabeth Bucknor. She's going to share some information about how we are framing our technical assistance for you as we move forward. So Elizabeth, let me turn this over to you real quick.
Hello and good afternoon. It is my pleasure to be sharing with you a big project we've been working on as a team to amplify your work. So we know that everyone here is an elite, I guess that you actually had, elite projects. You all were part of a peer review process for receiving the award and to become an OELA grantee. And that is a wonderful achievement. Truly, you were brought together for that reason, and we are doing all we can to amplify the good work that you do. So as you can see, we've brought together Project Amplify, and we have 3 different pillars as part of that. So the first part is looking at technical assistance. I myself am also a program officer. And so a core piece of all of us as program officers is to provide technical assistance. But a big message as part of Project Amplify that we want to convey is that this is a partnership with you. Please do make sure you're working closely with your program officers in all the different things that happen throughout your grant. We do know the realities of a wonderful project proposal and then that implementation process and little hiccups that can happen along the way. I actually love how Belinda stated it yesterday, that sometimes you have to take little side roads and all these things, but keep moving forward and to get back on the main road. And as you're thinking about those small segues and little hiccups that happen, make sure you're including your program officer as part of that process in keeping all that together, keeping us informed, and we come with a wealth of knowledge because we do have the broader overview of all the different grants that have come and that we work with. So we know how to actually provide you additional examples and ways to work through those little hiccups. So part of that, we also want to make sure you have lots of ample resources and different ways to get that information. KMS, we do have some resources in there, but we're going to continue to be adding to that with a variety of resources in a variety of formats for you. We're going to be amplifying you in that way. Pillar 2, as you can see, is amplifying you with the community of practice. As you can see, even as part of this conference, we've been making sure that there are opportunities to network and get to know your colleagues and your peers and bringing that together in ways to connect and collaborate. So we want to help you in bringing this together and help you with the leveraging your wealth of knowledge that you all bring. The third pillar, as you can see, is we have a very strong goal to amplify your voice. We do want to be making sure we feature all the work that you're doing. If you have websites, we would love to know about them and share them. We have multiple social media outlets. So, let's see, we have Facebook, we have Twitter, I think we even started a Pinterest account where we know that a lot of teachers go for resources. So if you have teacher resources, we can share those there. So please do make sure that you are sharing that with your program officers, sharing it with us. We want to hear about what you're doing so we can make sure that is being disseminated more broadly. And as you can also see, we want to support your publishing goals. So other ways that you're taking your research and data and making sure it is going out and making a difference in the work that you're doing. So please do make sure you are sharing that with us as part of this Project Amplify. So quickly, on to the next one. You can see I just want to go a little bit more into our community of practice. Right now, we have 6 areas that we are focusing on right now with the new Project Amplify. So as you can see quickly, we will be putting together, our team will be announcing to you things from virtual thematic and SIG chats, where we can come together as small groups on certain topics, other collaboration opportunities. You can see cross-sharing of events and processes. We would love to know what you're doing so we can tell others about it. So you can just see the types of things and how you're putting together your grant work. Conference meet and greet. So even outside of our conference here, the Project Directors Meeting, we hope that you can leverage other conferences that you're at to meet with your colleagues and peers there. Let's see, we also have the Kms Discussion Board. We are still working to make that a very robust place to share between sessions. So outside of conferences and meetings, we can leverage the discussion board to share information and provide opportunities for you. And last but not least, here today, again, we are doing lots to bring that together. All right, so last but not least, this is it. Help us amplify you as part of Project Amplify. So again, share your activities, events, presentations, publications, wherever you're gonna be, let us know. Last but not least, I guess this is a very abbreviated overview of this project, but we would also like to hear more about your ideas and ways that we can continue to support you as we grow Project Amplify for your benefit. So please do send those updates to me. And then also, last but not least, a little plug for our Nexus newsletter. Here's the link to how to subscribe. It does go out bi-weekly. So thank you so much. And on that note, we will be heading in. Oh, thank you.
So just in parting, I just want to let you all know that the one thing I love to do, I meet with the Deputy Secretary on a bi-weekly basis. And one thing I love to do is show off my grantees and all the wonderful work that you all do. So please do to send us all the wonderful work that you do, your accomplishments. We love to show off. And it also helps us when we go back for our budget request to show how effective this program is. We show it through our GEPRA measures and all of these other things, but when we have more information that we can share, it's always helpful. So we want to encourage you all to send us all the wonderful work that you do, continue to keep us in the loop, and just let us know how we can support you. And one last thing is, if any of you want to meet with me one-on-one, we have a sign-up sheet so that we can just organize ourselves, no other good reason, at the front desk. And so I'd be happy to meet with you one-on-one for any concerns, anything else that you would like us to know, and make sure that, you can always, of course, catch me in the hallway, but that way we'll have a little bit of dedicated private time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's such a pleasure. Celeste has a little.
Yeah, just a quick note. We're a little bit off schedule. We will go ahead and break now, and we will come back at 10:55. Thank you.